June 10, 1944. Oradour-sur-Glane, central France. A Waffen-SS unit entered a quiet village in broad daylight, sealed it off, separated the men from the women and children, and by evening, hundreds of civilians were dead and the village was burning. That single afternoon explains far more about Das Reich than any battlefield legend ever could. By the summer of 1944, the 2nd SS Panzer Division, Das Reich, already carried one of the most feared names in Hitler's war machine. Inside the German system, that fear was often framed as admiration. Das Reich was treated as a hard division, an elite formation, a unit expected to absorb punishment and still keep moving. It had fought in some of the most brutal theaters of the war. It had survived disasters that shattered weaker formations. It had taken losses, rebuilt, and returned. But fear does not always mean the same thing. For German commanders, Das Reich could mean offensive power, ideological reliability, and a formation willing to do what others might not. For civilians in occupied territory, and for enemies who had watched the SS expand across Europe, the meaning was darker. The name did not point only to combat skill. It pointed to coercion, reprisals, anti-partisan warfare, and a version of military power that was political from the beginning. That is the real core of this story. Because Das Reich did not become feared by battlefield performance alone, it became feared in two directions at once. One reputation was built inside the Reich, where the Waffen-SS sold itself as harder, more loyal, and more aggressive than the regular army. The other was built outside it, where the same qualities could look less like discipline and more like menace. That split matters, because it changes the entire meaning of the division's rise. The familiar version is simple. Das Reich was one of Hitler's elite SS divisions, fought in major campaigns, gained a fearsome reputation, and became one of the symbols of Waffen-SS power. That version is not false. It is just incomplete. The stronger version is that Das Reich became feared because the Nazi regime wanted a formation that could fuse battlefield force with political hardness. It wanted soldiers who did not simply fight. It wanted soldiers who embodied the will of the regime. Once that happened, the division's reputation could no longer stay inside ordinary military boundaries. That is why Oradour matters so much as the opening image. Not because it tells the whole history of Das Reich in one scene, it does not, but because it reveals what the name had come to mean by 1944. A division that had marched through Poland, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union did not arrive in France as a blank military instrument. It arrived carrying years of SS identity, combat prestige, ideological conditioning, and a pattern of violence that made civilians fear the name long before many of them ever saw the insignia up close. And that is the first crack in the legend. Later, admirers often tried to isolate Das Reich inside a purely military frame. They highlighted armored actions, operational skill, discipline under pressure, and battlefield resilience. They presented fear as a compliment. But with a formation like this, fear was never just a compliment. It was evidence. It showed that the division's power had always been tied to something larger and uglier than tactical success. Subscribe now so you don't miss the next SS legend, which will make even more sense after this one. That does not mean every man in the division committed the same crimes or entered the war with the same background. Historical precision matters. Das Reich changed over time. It expanded, bled, rebuilt, took replacements, and adapted as the war deepened. But institutions develop identities that later members inherit whether they fully understand them or not. Das Reich carried an SS identity from the beginning, and by the middle of the war, that identity had become inseparable from how others experienced the division. So, the real question is not just how Das Reich fought. The real question is how a division became so feared that its name could mean prestige in one world and terror in another. To answer that, the story has to go back before Normandy, before Oradour, before the final collapse of the Third Reich. It has to go back to the years when the Waffen-SS was still building its image, and when the men behind it believed they were creating something harder, purer, and more dependable than a normal army unit. Das Reich did not begin the war as the finished monster people later remembered. Like the Waffen-SS itself, it was built in layers. The SS began as a political guard formation inside the Nazi movement, Under Heinrich Himmler, it expanded into a vast power structure tied to ideology, policing, racial policy, concentration camps, and eventually military formations. The Waffen-SS grew out of that world. It was not simply another army wearing different uniforms. It belonged to an organization whose power was political, racial, and coercive from the start. That mattered enormously. Because when the Waffen-SS created combat units, it was not only trying to raise more troops, it was trying to build an image. These formations were supposed to be politically reliable, ideologically hardened, and personally tied to the Nazi state. Their battlefield value mattered, but so did their symbolic value. They were meant to look like the new German warrior elite. Das Reich emerged inside that ambition. It grew from earlier SS Verfügungstruppe formations, before becoming the SS Division Reich and later Das Reich. Even the name carried political meaning. This was not a regional title, not a neutral regimental tradition, not a simple numerical label. The name pointed upward, toward the state and the regime itself. It suggested a formation fighting not just for Germany in a broad national sense, but for the Nazi Reich as a political order. That gave the division a built-in mystique. It also gave it a built-in danger. When Germany invaded Poland in 1939, the Waffen-SS was still proving itself. In the campaigns of the early war years, SS units sought prestige through aggressive action. But they also revealed a pattern that would never fully disappear. Political loyalty and violence often traveled together. During the campaign in the West in 1940, men from SS formations were already linked to atrocities against prisoners and civilians. Das Reich was part of a military culture inside the SS that pushed hardness as virtue and restraint as weakness. Then came the East. Operation Barbarossa on June 22, 1941, turned Germany's war into something larger and darker than a conventional campaign. The invasion of the Soviet Union was conceived by the Nazi regime as a war of annihilation. The front became the meeting point of military conquest, racial ideology, anti-partisan warfare, mass murder, and occupation terror. For divisions like Das Reich, this mattered more than any parade ground mythology ever could. On the Eastern Front, fear was no longer abstract. Villages burned, civilians disappeared, partisan warfare and anti-partisan warfare blurred the line between military action and reprisal. SS units gained reputations not just because they fought hard, but because they operated inside a theater where brutality became normal policy. It is important to stay exact here. Not every crime in the East belonged to Das Reich. The German war in the Soviet Union involved the Wehrmacht, SS formations, police battalions, occupation authorities, auxiliaries, and killing units working in overlapping ways. Historical seriousness collapses when every horror is lazily pushed onto one badge. But reputations are not built by legal precision alone. What civilians and enemy soldiers often saw was simpler. They saw SS insignia. They saw a formation connected to a regime already known for terror. They saw a type of soldier whose role looked political as much as military. That alone was enough to make the division feared in a way that ordinary battlefield effectiveness could not explain. And yet, inside Germany, the same process was creating a second reputation. Das Reich fought in major operations and bled heavily. It was used in demanding sectors. It gained combat prestige through endurance, offensive action, and a willingness to keep fighting under severe pressure. As the war deepened, that became part of the Waffen-SS legend. These were the men, the regime claimed, who would hold when others broke. That is the second fracture in the myth, because the more a division proved its hardness, the more the regime exploited it. Prestige did not protect units like Das Reich. It made them easier to spend. Once Berlin believed a formation could absorb punishment and still attack, it became easier to send it into sectors where the strategic logic was already failing. The division's battlefield reputation therefore grew alongside another truth. Its strength was real enough to be useful. Its usefulness made it expendable, and its SS identity ensured that fear followed the division, whether it was seen through the eyes of German propagandists, occupied civilians, or Soviet troops who had learned what the SS meant on the ground. By 1943, Das Reich had become exactly the kind of formation Himmler wanted the Waffen-SS to showcase: experienced, reliable in combat, politically dependable, known by name. But that same reputation now carried a moral burden that battlefield legend could not wash away. And once a division reaches that point, fear becomes unstable. It starts as a weapon. Later it becomes evidence against the very image that created it. By the middle of the war, Das Reich was no longer just another SS formation trying to prove itself. It was one of the divisions the regime could point to when it wanted to advertise toughness, and that made the next stage of its rise even more revealing. In early 1943, after the disaster at Stalingrad, the German front in the east was under immense pressure. The Wehrmacht had suffered a strategic shock from which it would never fully recover. But Hitler still wanted counterblows, still wanted symbols of recovery, and still needed formations that could deliver quick results in moments of crisis. Das Reich was one of those formations. In the battles around Kharkov in early 1943, SS armored formations, including Das Reich, helped stabilize part of the front and retake the city in March. Inside the German military imagination, actions like this fed the myth perfectly. When the war seemed to be slipping, divisions like Das Reich could still be presented as proof that nerve, mobility, and ruthless counterattack might reverse the tide. That image mattered politically as much as militarily. Kharkov helped reinforce the idea that the Waffen-SS represented a harder edge than the regular army. Das Reich looked like a division that could still strike back when the Reich most needed a symbol of recovered momentum. Then came Kursk. In July 1943, Germany launched Operation Citadel, the great attempt to pinch off the Kursk salient and regain the initiative on the Eastern Front. Das Reich took part in the southern attack. In tactical terms, it remained a formidable formation. It had armor, combat experience, and officers trained to press hard. But Kursk exposed a truth that no amount of propaganda could hide. Even divisions with real combat value could no longer break Soviet defenses quickly enough to restore Germany's strategic position. This is where the title promise begins to pay off. Das Reich became feared partly because it could fight. That part was real. But its rise also depended on a regime desperate for symbols stronger than its actual position. The more the strategic situation worsened, the more divisions like Das Reich were used to create the illusion that political will and elite formations could still overcome material reality. After Kursk, that illusion became harder to sustain. The Red Army had learned too much, built too much, and adapted too well. Germany could still hurt its enemies. It could no longer assume that its feared divisions could decide the future. And that meant Das Reich's prestige was beginning to change. It still inspired fear, but fear now came mixed with exhaustion, attrition, and the growing knowledge that the division was fighting inside a war whose logic had turned against it. Then the story shifted west. By 1944, Das Reich was refitting in southwestern France after severe combat on the Eastern Front. On paper, this looked like recovery. In reality, it was a pause inside a worsening war. The Allies were preparing to land in the West. Resistance activity in occupied France was intensifying. The division was rebuilding, but it was rebuilding inside a political military system already fraying at the edges. Then came June 6, 1944. The Allied landings in Normandy triggered immediate pressure. German formations in France were ordered to move north. Das Reich began the long march toward the invasion front. It should have been a military redeployment. Instead, it became something darker. Resistance attacks, sabotage, blown rail lines, ambushes, and delay operations slowed the division's movement. That mattered operationally because time was everything after D-Day. It also mattered psychologically. A division shaped by SS methods, carrying Eastern Front experience, and moving through a country where armed resistance was growing, did not treat delay as a normal military inconvenience. It interpreted it through a harsher logic: reprisal, intimidation, collective punishment, pressure on civilians, pressure on suspected resistance networks. That is how the division's two reputations fused. On one side, Das Reich was hurrying north as a feared combat formation the German command wanted in Normandy. On the other, it was leaving behind a trail of executions, reprisals, and terror in central and southwestern France. Toul on June 9th, Oradour-sur-Glane on June 10th. And now, the entire rise becomes impossible to romanticize. At Oradour-sur-Glane, troops from Der Führer Regiment of Das Reich entered the village, gathered the inhabitants, separated men from women and children, and killed 642 civilians before burning the village. Even after the war, key parts of the exact decision chain remained disputed. Why this village? Why this method? And how much of the violence was linked to resistance activity, captured SS officers, rumor, confusion, or pre-existing SS reprisal logic has never been settled with perfect clarity. But one thing does not require speculation. By June 10, 1944, Das Reich had become feared in the most literal sense possible. Not merely as a battlefield division, not merely as a hard formation, but as a name civilians could associate with mass death. That is the collision point of the whole story. Fear had begun as part propaganda, part military reality, part SS ambition. At Oradour, it became memory. And once a division acquires that kind of memory, its reputation is no longer under its own control. There is an easy version of this story that sounds dramatic, but misses the deeper mechanism. It says Das Reich became feared because it was savage. There is truth in that, but not enough truth. The stronger version is that Das Reich became feared because the Nazi system rewarded exactly the combination that made the division so dangerous: combat aggression, ideological reliability, and a willingness to turn military movement into political terror. That changes the emphasis completely. It means the division's reputation was not an accidental byproduct of war. It was, in part, the intended result of the system that created it. The Waffen-SS was designed to be more than an army branch. It was supposed to embody a harder political will. Once formations like Das Reich internalized that role, fear became one of their strategic effects. This is also where the myth versus reality gap becomes impossible to ignore. Post-war admirers often tried to present elite Waffen-SS divisions as apolitical fighting machines trapped inside a criminal regime around them. Das Reich is one of the clearest reasons that interpretation collapses. The division's military record cannot be peeled away neatly from the institutional and ideological environment that shaped it. Its battlefield actions gave it prestige. Its SS identity gave that prestige a different meaning. Its conduct in occupied zones showed what happened when those two things fused. That does not require exaggeration. It requires proportion. Das Reich was not feared only because it massacred civilians in France in 1944. By then, the division had already spent years becoming the kind of formation that could do such things under pressure and still keep moving. The path to Oradour did not begin that morning. It began in the political culture of the SS, in the Eastern War of Annihilation, in the normalization of reprisal logic, and in a command world where brutality was often treated as evidence of seriousness rather than the failure. Here is the hidden factor that sharpens the whole case. The more feared Das Reich became, the more useful it became to Hitler's system. And the more useful it became, the more likely it was to be inserted into impossible or degrading situations where violence spread outward. Fear, in other words, was not just a reputation earned in battle. It was a resource the regime kept spending. That matters for another reason too. Fear can make a formation look stronger than it really is. For a time, Das Reich's name suggested elite power and offensive energy. But by 1944 and 1945, much of that feared prestige was operating inside a shrinking strategic horizon. Germany was losing industrial depth, fuel, trained replacements, and operational freedom. The division still had combat value. It no longer had a war it could save. So the reputation kept growing darker at exactly the moment its strategic usefulness was narrowing. That is one of the great ironies of the story. Das Reich became one of Hitler's most feared divisions, just as Hitler's war was becoming less winnable and more dependent on coercion, fantasy, and symbolic resistance. The division's rise therefore says as much about the regime's decline as it does about SS strength. A political system that keeps asking for fanatical performance eventually creates feared formations. It also creates formations whose fearsome image hides deep strategic failure. And that is why the title is stronger than it first appears. How did Das Reich become one of Hitler's most feared SS divisions? Not by fighting well alone. It became feared because the Reich built a kind of military power that could not stay within normal military limits. It demanded ideological soldiers, rewarded harshness, tolerated reprisal, and celebrated aggression, even when aggression was no substitute for strategy. Das Reich rose inside that design. Its reputation made sense inside that design. And once civilians, partisans, Allied observers, and occupied populations experienced the division directly, the fear surrounding it no longer belonged to German propaganda. It belonged to memory. That is the part the flatter military versions can never fully explain. After Normandy, Das Reich continued to fight. It remained a major Waffen-SS formation through the later phases of the war, including the Ardennes campaign and the final retreat into Germany and Austria. On paper, the division still existed. In military terms, it could still resist, counterattack, and inflict losses. But by that stage, the real meaning of its rise had already been set. Das Reich had become feared in a way no simple battlefield summary could contain. At the beginning, the division's image served the ambitions of the SS. It suggested elite purpose, ideological steel, and a formation closer to Hitler's political will than an ordinary unit of the army. In a regime obsessed with hardness, that image had obvious value. Then war expanded the meaning. Combat on the Eastern Front gave Das Reich real military prestige, but it also placed the division inside a theater where SS identity was inseparable from wider structures of terror, reprisal warfare, occupation violence, and ideological brutality ensured that the name did not travel through Europe as a neutral one. Then France fixed the meaning in public memory. Thule and Oradour-sur-Glane turned fear into something visible and lasting. They made it impossible to treat Das Reich only as a hard combat division with a controversial political uniform. The division's name became attached to a pattern of violence that outlived the Reich itself. That is the final payoff. Das Reich became one of Hitler's most feared SS divisions because the Nazi system had built a formation designed to inspire awe inside Germany and intimidation outside it. It gave the division military tasks, political meaning, and ideological conditioning, then sent it through theaters where violence kept erasing the line between soldiering and terror. Once that happened, the division's reputation stopped belonging to its own mythology. It belonged to everyone who had to endure it. There is no clean heroic ending available there. No serious version in which battlefield efficiency wipes away institutional identity. No honest version in which fear means only respect. No convincing version in which a division can serve the SS, move through occupied Europe, leave behind atrocities, and still be judged only by its armored record. And that is why the phrase "most feared" has to be handled carefully. Feared by whom? For what? Under what conditions? Inside Hitler's war machine, Das Reich was feared in part because it looked like a model of the kind of force the regime wanted more of. Outside it, the division was feared because people learned what followed when that force arrived. Those two meanings were never truly separate. They were the same story seen from opposite sides. In the end, Das Reich did not become feared by accident. It became feared because the Nazi state cultivated a kind of power that mixed combat prestige with political violence, and then treated the mixture as strength. The division's battlefield reputation was real enough. So was the terror attached to its name. One did not cancel the other. Together, they explain why the division rose so high inside the Waffen-SS imagination, and why its memory remains so dark. That is the last reversal. A name meant to project strength ended up preserving something else. Evidence of what that strength had really been used for. So, when people later remembered Das Reich as one of Hitler's most feared SS divisions, the most honest reading was never the flattering one. It was the harder one. The division was feared because it had become exactly what the regime wanted. A formation whose military value, political loyalty, and readiness for terror could no longer be separated. And once a division reaches that point, fear is no longer just part of its legend. Fear is the verdict.